What happens when an undercover CEO discovers the harsh reality of his own business? A restaurant owner, thinking his company was thriving, goes undercover as a dishwasher, only to find his employees overworked, underpaid, and mistreated. What he uncovers shakes him to his core, leading to a drastic decision that changes everything. This isn't just a story about leadership, it's about justice, accountability, and doing what's right. Stay tuned, because this undercover CEO is about to take control in a way no one saw coming. Ethan Reynolds had spent years building his restaurant chain from the ground up, priding himself on quality service and a strong company culture. But lately, troubling reports had been piling up. Customer reviews mentioned slow service, unclean tables, and rude staff. Even worse, an anonymous email from an employee painted a disturbing picture of the working conditions. "If you care about this company, come see how we're treated. We're drowning." Ethan had always trusted his managers to handle daily operations, but now doubts crept in. Were his employees really being overworked and mistreated? Was the company he had built turning into something he no longer recognized? Determined to find out the truth, Ethan made a bold decision. He would go undercover as a dishwasher at one of his busiest restaurants. It was the only way to see firsthand what was really happening behind the kitchen doors. Swapping his suit and tie for worn-out jeans, an apron, and a fake name, he stepped into his own restaurant as just another new hire. No one recognized him, and that was exactly what he wanted. For the first time, Ethan would experience what it truly meant to work at his company, not as the owner, but as one of his own employees. Ethan walked into Reynolds' Bistro, one of his busiest restaurant locations, as Ben, the new dishwasher, his usual presence, a confident businessman in a tailored suit, was now replaced by a faded apron, scuffed sneakers, and a baseball cap pulled low. The disguise worked. No one gave him a second glance. He was just another new hire, expected to keep his head down and work. His first impression of the kitchen was chaos. The air was thick with the scent of sizzling oil and freshly baked bread, but the tension among the staff was even heavier. Orders piled up, the line cooks worked frantically, and the dish station, his new home, was already overflowing with dirty plates and grease-coated pans. Before he could introduce himself, a stern voice barked, "Hey, newbie! Dishes don't clean themselves!" Ethan turned to see Rosa, a senior line cook in her early 50s, eyeing him with a mix of exhaustion and expectation. She handed him a soaked apron, barely acknowledging him before turning back to the stove. Ethan quickly realized there was no orientation, no training, just work. He plunged his hands into hot, soapy water, scrubbing as fast as he could while the pile continued growing. Within an hour, his back arched, his hands were raw, and sweat dripped down his face. Rosa glanced at him and smirked. "Still breathing, newbie?" she asked. Ethan forced a smile. But he wasn't the only one struggling. Servers like Jordan, a young waiter in his late 20s, rushed back and forth, balancing trays while dodging sharp orders from Derek, the kitchen manager. Derek had the presence of a drill sergeant, yelling at cooks for being too slow and snapping at dishwashers like Ethan to move faster. Ethan expected the work to be tough, but he hadn't expected the fear. Staff avoided Derek's gaze, flinching at his outbursts. No one took breaks. There wasn't time. Rosa, despite her experience, looked exhausted, her movements mechanical. Miguel, a fellow dishwasher, whispered to Ethan that they were often forced to clock out early, but were expected to finish their shifts unpaid. Ethan felt a pit in his stomach. This wasn't just mismanagement, this was exploitation. And if this was happening in one location, how deep did the problem go? He had come looking for the truth, and now, standing at the dish station with aching hands, he was starting to find it. As the lunch rush hit, Ethan struggled to keep up. Stacks of dirty dishes piled high, and the kitchen only grew hotter, louder, and more chaotic. He had barely caught his breath when Derek, the kitchen manager, stormed in, barking orders like a drill sergeant. "Move faster, this isn't a retirement home," he sneered at Miguel, who was scrubbing at a stubborn stain on a pan. Miguel didn't argue. He just worked faster, his hands trembling slightly. Ethan turned to see Rosa at the grill, her movements precise but strained. She had been working nonstop for hours, sweat glistening on her brow. He leaned in and asked, "Do we get breaks?" Rosa let out a humorless laugh. "Supposed to, but if we stop, we fall behind, and if we fall behind, Derek loses it. Just then, Derek stomped toward them. Why are you two talking? Rosa, orders are backing up. Ben, stop slacking. Rosa's grip on the spatula tightened, but she said nothing. Ethan clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay in character. He needed to see how far this went. As the hours dragged on, he noticed more disturbing patterns. Miguel quietly mentioned that they were often forced to clock out early to save on labor costs, yet expected to finish their work unpaid. Jordan, the waiter, muttered under his breath that staffing was intentionally kept low to cut expenses, leaving servers overwhelmed and dealing with angry customers. It wasn't just overwork, it was fear. Employees avoided eye contact with Derek, flinching at his harsh words. In the break room, conversations were whispered, as if even talking too much might get them in trouble. The final straw came when a server approached the kitchen, visibly distressed. A guest had been waiting nearly an hour for their food and was furious. Instead of handling the situation professionally, Derek scoffed, "Maybe if the cooks weren't so lazy, we wouldn't have this problem." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Ethan watched Rosa's shoulders stiffen, but she stayed silent. Jordan pressed his lips together, swallowing the insult like he had no choice but to accept it. That was when Ethan realized this wasn't just a bad manager. This was a toxic system built on intimidation and exploitation, and it was his company allowing it to happen. By mid-afternoon, Ethan's arms burned from scrubbing dishes, and the heat in the kitchen was unbearable. But he wasn't the only one suffering. Rosa, who had been moving non-stop since morning, looked pale. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped a steak, her movements sluggish. Ethan noticed her swaying, struggling to stay upright. "Rosa, are you okay?" he asked under his breath. She forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, just a little dizzy." Before he could say more, Derek stormed in, scowling. "Why is this order taking so long? Move it, Rosa!" Rosa gripped the counter for support, inhaling sharply. She looked like she was about to collapse. "She needs a break," Ethan said firmly, unable to hold back any longer. Derek scoffed. "A break? You think this is a daycare? If she can't handle it, she can leave." The words hit hard. Rosa lowered her gaze, her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. She couldn't afford to. Ethan felt his stomach twist in anger. This wasn't just tough management. This was cruelty. For the rest of the shift, Ethan watched as Rosa forced herself to keep going. Miguel moved like a ghost, exhausted and afraid to slow down. Jordan barely kept up with demanding customers, getting no support from management. But what truly set Ethan off was a conversation he overheard near the back storage room. Derek was speaking with another manager, laughing. "These people should be grateful they even have jobs," Derek said smugly. "If they complain, I'll replace them. Simple as that." Ethan's fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had seen enough. That night as he left the restaurant, his body ached, but it was nothing compared to what he felt inside. He had built this company from nothing, believing it stood for quality, respect, and integrity. But standing in that kitchen, he had witnessed just how far it had fallen. Walking to his car, he pulled out his phone. "Cancel my meetings for tomorrow," he told his assistant. "I have unfinished business at the restaurant." Tomorrow, he wouldn't walk in as Ben the dishwasher, he would walk in as Ethan Reynolds, the owner, and things were about to change. The next morning, Ethan Reynolds walked into his restaurant not as Ben the dishwasher, but as himself, the owner of the entire chain. Gone was the worn-out apron and cap, in their place a crisp button-down shirt and an expression that left no room for argument. The moment he stepped into the kitchen, conversations halted mid-sentence. Employees exchanged confused glances, some recognizing him immediately, while others struggled to connect the exhausted dishwasher from yesterday with the powerful man standing before them today. Derek emerged from his office, frowning. "Who the hell are—" He stopped cold. His face went pale as recognition set in. Ethan didn't waste time. Staff meeting. Now. Minutes later, the entire kitchen crew and front-of-house staff gathered in the break room. Murmurs filled the air. Everyone was on edge, sensing that something big was about to happen. Derek stood off to the side, arms crossed, but there was no longer confidence in his posture. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room. For the past 2 days, I've been working in this restaurant. I saw everything. A ripple of shock moved through the staff. Some gasped, others looked down, suddenly afraid. I saw how hard you work, Ethan continued, voice steady but firm. I saw how you're forced to skip breaks, how you're yelled at for things beyond your control, and how you're overworked and underappreciated. His eyes locked onto Derek. And I saw how some people in leadership think fear is an acceptable way to manage a team. Derek's jaw tightened. With all due respect, sir, you don't understand how hard it is to keep... Ethan cut him off coldly. I understand plenty. I understand that you have spent years mistreating your employees, cutting corners and creating a toxic work environment. And I understand that as of this moment, you're fired. A stunned silence filled the room. Then a sharp inhale from the staff, followed by whispers. Derek's face turned red. You can't do that. I can, and I just did. Ethan nodded to security, who had already stepped inside. You'll be escorted out. Derek opened his mouth to argue, but one look at Ethan's expression stopped him. With a final glare at the staff, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Ethan turned back to his employees. Things are going to change, starting now. As the break room settled, the tension in the air shifted. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just their boss, he was someone who had seen their struggle firsthand. He took a deep breath, rolling up his sleeves as he leaned against a nearby table. Now that Derek is gone, I need to hear from all of you. No managers, no filters. Tell me what's really going on. A long silence stretched before Miguel, the dishwasher, finally spoke. We're exhausted, sir. His voice was quiet but firm. We don't have enough people. The workload never changes, but the staff keeps getting cut. Jordan, the young waiter, nodded in agreement. It's the same in front of the house. We're always short-staffed, so when service is slow, guests take it out on us, but management never backs us up. We just get blamed. Ethan listened, taking notes as, one by one, his employees began to open up. Rosa, still visibly drained from the previous day, sighed. We don't just need more hands, we need respect. She looked him in the eyes, exhaustion giving way to something else. Frustration. We work hard, but we're treated like we're disposable. Another cook chimed in, and don't get me started on pay. The hours keep getting cut, but rent doesn't. Ethan's chest tightened. He had always believed in treating employees fairly, but somewhere along the way, his company had lost sight of that. I hear you, he said after a moment, meeting each of their eyes, and I'm not here to make empty promises. This stops today. The employees exchanged wary glances. They had heard managers promise change before, only for nothing to happen. But Ethan wasn't just any manager, he was the owner, and he had seen the truth for himself. Effective immediately, he continued, we're increasing staff to make sure no one is overworked. Breaks will be mandatory, and I'm reviewing pay across the board. A few stunned gasps. Rosa blinked, as if waiting for a catch. And one more thing, Ethan added, we're implementing an anonymous reporting system. No more fear. If something's wrong, I want to hear about it, without retaliation. For the first time since he stepped into that kitchen, he saw something new in his employees' eyes. Oh, Ethan didn't waste time. The moment he left the break room, he made calls to corporate, human resources, and his finance team. Change wasn't just a promise, it was a priority. Within hours, a temporary staffing agency was contacted to bring in more dishwashers, servers, and cooks to lighten the burden. Permanent hiring initiatives were launched, ensuring that every shift would be fully staffed moving forward. The next order of business was pay and scheduling. Ethan reviewed employee wages, making immediate adjustments to ensure his staff was earning a fair, competitive rate. Overtime pay was reinforced, and the abusive practice of forcing employees to clock out early while still working was officially banned. Notices were posted in the break room, clearly outlining employees' rights and protections, so no one could be exploited again. But policies alone wouldn't fix the culture of fear Derek had created. Ethan needed the right leadership in place. After personally interviewing candidates, he found the perfect fit. Adrian Lopez, a seasoned restaurant manager known for treating employees with fairness while maintaining high performance. The day Adrian arrived, Ethan gathered the staff. "This restaurant has been through a rough time," he said, his voice firm but steady. "But that ends today. Adrian is here to help rebuild, and I expect every one of you to hold us accountable." Adrian stepped forward, confidence in his stance. "I know trust isn't given, it's earned. I'm here to listen, to support you, and to make sure this restaurant is a place where you feel valued." Skepticism lingered, but for the first time, the staff was being heard. Beyond this location, Ethan expanded the changes across all his restaurants. He mandated audits at every store, ensuring that bad managers elsewhere wouldn't get away with the same abusive tactics. An anonymous reporting system was launched, giving employees a safe way to voice concerns. Within weeks, the transformation was visible. Employees took their breaks without fear, workloads were manageable, and morale began to improve. The kitchen no longer felt like a battlefield, and, for the first time in a long time, employees walked in with confidence, not dread. As Ethan watched his staff move with renewed energy, he realized that change wasn't just about fixing mistakes. It was about building something better. And this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the changes Ethan had implemented began to take shape, and the restaurant felt like an entirely different place. The chaos in the kitchen had eased, not because the work had lessened, but because now there were enough hands to do it properly. No more frantic rushing, no more skipped breaks, no more employees working in fear of management. Rosa, once exhausted and on the verge of collapse, now moved with energy, her sharp eyes scanning the grill station like a true professional. Jordan, the waiter who had once been overwhelmed and ignored, now had the support he needed. More servers had been hired, allowing the front-of-house team to keep up with demand without being pushed to their limits. He no longer had to brace himself for customer complaints about slow service, because now, service wasn't slow, it was efficient. But the biggest shift wasn't just in workflow, it was in morale. Employees who had once worked in silent fear now spoke freely, exchanging jokes in the break room, laughing between orders, and walking with their heads held high. They weren't just surviving their shifts anymore, they were working with pride. One afternoon, as Ethan walked through the restaurant, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A moment so small, yet so significant. Rosa was sitting at a table with Miguel, actually enjoying her break. A cup of coffee rested in her hands, and she was smiling, chatting with another line cook. For the first time, she didn't look like she was running on empty. She caught Ethan's gaze and raised her cup in a silent toast. No words were needed. He understood. As he moved through the restaurant, he noticed other signs of change. The kitchen was running smoothly, yet without the usual edge of panic. The servers weren't being berated, but instead supported by their new manager, Adrian, who worked alongside them rather than above them. This wasn't just a temporary fix. It was a new beginning. And as Ethan watched his employees working, not just harder, but happier, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Pride, not just in the business, but in the people who made it great. As the transformation at the restaurant became undeniable, Ethan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a single location problem. If it had happened here, it could be happening at any of his other restaurants. He couldn't afford to assume that his managers were doing their jobs correctly. He needed to see it for himself. Without wasting time, he launched a full internal audit of every location in his restaurant chain. Surprise inspections, anonymous employee surveys, and in-depth financial reviews were rolled out across all restaurants. What he uncovered was shocking. At one location, a manager had been manipulating schedules to avoid giving employees overtime pay. He was fired within days. At another, kitchen staff were still being forced to clock out early but continue working unpaid. Ethan not only ended this practice, but also issued back pay to every affected employee. But Ethan didn't stop at correcting past mistakes. He made an example out of those who had abused their authority. Managers who had fostered toxic work environments were replaced with leaders who prioritized both efficiency and employee well-being. New training programs were introduced to teach managers how to lead with fairness and respect instead of fear and intimidation. The biggest shift, however, was in culture. Employees who once felt trapped and voiceless now had a direct line to leadership. The new anonymous reporting system gave them a way to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. And more importantly, they saw real results. When complaints were made, action was taken. 6 months after Ethan first stepped into that dishwashing station, his company was stronger than ever. Employee turnover had dropped to an all-time low, customer satisfaction had soared, not because corners were being cut to save money, but because restaurants were finally delivering the service and quality they had always promised. One evening, as Ethan sat in the break room of the original restaurant, surrounded by Rosa, Miguel, Jordan, and the other employees who had endured the worst of it, he realized just how far they had come. Jordan leaned back in his chair and grinned. "You really shook things up, boss." Ethan chuckled. "Had to. I let things slip too far without realizing it." Rosa tilted her head. Most CEOs wouldn't have bothered. They would have fired a few people and moved on. Ethan met her gaze. Most CEOs are doing it wrong. Ethan walked through the restaurant early that morning, taking in the changes. The once chaotic, fear-driven environment had transformed into something he was truly proud of. Employees greeted him with nods and genuine smiles, a stark contrast to the wary, exhausted faces he had seen just months ago. The tension was gone, replaced by confidence and energy. In the kitchen, Rosa was training new hires, her voice calm but firm as she showed them the proper way to handle the grill. Miguel and the dishwashing crew worked efficiently, but without the frantic desperation they once had. Jordan laughed with another server, something Ethan had never seen before. This wasn't just a better workplace, it was a healthier, happier one. Ethan knew that the fight wasn't over. Change wasn't something that happened overnight, nor was it something that lasted without effort. But he also knew that he had built something worth protecting. As he turned to leave, Rosa caught his eye and raised a coffee cup in his direction. No words were needed. He understood. This wasn't just about running a business. It was about doing what was right. And this time he knew for sure he was leading the right way. The biggest lesson from Ethan's journey is that true leadership isn't about profit margins or efficiency. It's about people. He had spent years trusting that his managers were running his restaurants properly, but his undercover experience showed him the harsh reality: neglect, exploitation, and a culture of fear. It wasn't enough to assume things were fine from a distance. Real leadership meant being present, listening, and taking action. Ethan learned that a business is only as strong as the people behind it. When employees are overworked, disrespected, and treated as disposable, the entire operation suffers. But when they are valued, supported, and empowered, productivity and morale soar. Not because they are forced to work harder, but because they want to. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that change starts from the top. A leader's responsibility isn't just to fix problems, but to prevent them from happening in the first place. By holding managers accountable and prioritizing fairness, Ethan didn't just improve one restaurant, he rebuilt a company culture rooted in integrity, respect, and trust. In the end, Ethan didn't just save his business, he saved the people who made it thrive, and that made all the difference.